Russian mercenary searched for his companions in the trench, trying to count how many were still alive with him. He found only 2 bodies fallen in the muddy holes they had taken some time before. After months inside the city, fighting between buildings, he found himself in the open air, tense with the enemy's approach. He didn't realize where the danger was coming from. Thus, the soldier who had advanced for months through Bakhmut was wounded, who fought to take the city from the hands of the Ukrainians. Now hid in a hole and waited for the silent march of the enemies and their rifles in his direction. It was the beginning of May when tension once again spread through the Russian army. The leader of the Wagner group, Yevgeny Prigozhin, recorded a video in which he spat resentment at Putin's defense ministry. Sergei Shoigu was his main target in a speech macabrely illustrated by the corpses of dozens of Wagner group soldiers. The mercenaries lined up with still fresh blood was a hellish scene that threatened the cohesion of the Russian forces. And that was not the only problem. Disputes between other mercenary companies, the lack of ammunition, and the strange threat of the Wagner group leaving the city caused a turmoil from the lowest to the highest rank. At that moment, only 3% of Bakhmut was under Ukrainian control. Regular army troops also thickened in the city. However, other mercenary groups began to form. POTOK was funded by the powerful natural gas exporter Gazprom. The men from this company joined the Wagner group when the fighting in Bakhmut was already advanced and soon started a dispute that would lead to a loss of a hard-won position. The biggest conflict, however, was not this one. It was between the Russian Ministry of Defense and the Wagner group.
I am speaking on my own behalf. From the Board of Commanders of the private military company Wagner, we were put on so-called artificial ammunition shortage.
The lack of ammunition for the artillery was what soured Prigozhin's words and made him taste the blood of the mercenaries who fell without that key piece for his strategy. The required amount of projectiles fell to 30% in 2023 and then fell even further at the end of April. Without a full artillery, more mercenaries fell by the dozens, if not thousands, according to the words of their own leader.
They lie on the conscience of those who did not give us ammunition. And this is Defense Minister Shoigu Kuzmin. This is Gerasimov, the head of the Gestapo. For tens of thousands of killed and wounded in front of their mothers and children.
The Russians pressed with a steady strategy based on artillery and waves of mercenaries who signed their contracts, war veterans, watched the prisoners who went through quick training and learned about discipline at the point of a rifle. The squads prepared in groups of 8, looking nervously at each other as they heard the 80 and 120mm bombs burst on the Ukrainian defenses. The more of them, the better, as it would make the Ukrainians tremble inside the buildings while the concrete groaned and filled their hideouts with dust. The ex-prisoners wiped their sweat, looking at the weapons of the more experienced men with a cruel fear that the projectile that would take their lives would come out of the barrel of that face. If he backed down, the nervous silence increased. The more groups of 8 there were, the more prepared waves, the harder it was to reach the goal, and probably the easier their bodies would be obstacles to be assaulted by the next wave. One of the men moved forward with an RPOA Schmel. The weapon with thermobaric ammunition had an effective range of about 300 meters. The goal was to reach the next positions of the Ukrainian forces. The mercenaries ran under the watchful eyes of the drones. The first wave had to become the target at any cost. At any cost, as soon as they arrived, one of the soldiers put the RPO on his shoulder and fired at the Ukrainians who were already pouring ammunition against them. The RPO exploded against one of the buildings. The concrete painfully resisted the explosion. The Ukrainians hid, some injured and fallen on the ground, but the position was still held. The mercenaries warned over the radio that they were already settling in and knew where the enemies were. They marked the location and signaled for the next wave to come. One of them tried to count how many Ukrainians there were, checking if it was the amount they had detected by the drone. Then, in one of the warlord's strange extravagances, they were obliterated by a 23mm cannon from a BMP. The Russians didn't know, but from afar the Ukrainians were using it from inside a house. An improvised BMP cannon? The 23mm were an efficient advocate to cancel more contracts of men who fell on a bitter day. The Ukrainian hideout was almost knocked down when the Russian artillery resumed and the new wave came to occupy the place where the contracts had just been exams. The waves didn't end. Another one more. The artillery continued.
Despite
being far from the required amount, the mercenaries listened to the long space between the shots and knew that it could well mean that they might not have made the Ukrainians hunker down enough in their hideouts. More men enforcing their contracts advanced, reaching Ukrainians bleeding and with their ears ringing from the artillery and their eyes teary from the dust raised by the bombs or from seeing their friends already fallen at their feet. The Russian attack continued until they were in a position to take the Ukrainian positions. The drone was now observing what would be the final takeover of that hideout. A BMP tried to approach one of the points. The drone warned the troops fearing an armored attack against the new wave. Along the central...
an armored personnel carrier is driving as they accepted. The equipment
ended up being used to evacuate the wounded, realizing the need to remove from the battle
the men.
Exhausted, the Ukrainians held their defensive position, throwing grenades to keep the Russians at bay. In the desperation to escape the artillery that was starting to be thrown at them, a soldier was left behind. Communication was essential. The drone watched the Ukrainians moving and intrigued every point for the operators. The radios blared out orders and information that needed to be distilled quickly by the wave command. The men advanced slowly, taking fire every meter. The Ukrainians stood ready, awaiting the Russian advance. Their rifles appeared between the houses for suppression fire, giving enough time for someone with a rocket-propelled grenade to fire the missile against the incoming wave. The ammunition was running out, and the men's energy was decreasing every time they saw one of their own fall or their magazines emptied. Soon the mercenaries reached them, entering places that were heavily guarded.
Grenade, grenade, grenade. Damn it, don't go there under any circumstances. Kid, throw the grenade. Don't go in. Throw grenades into the windows. Don't
Don't go in.
like that. Good.
Connect.
Come on, go home, go. That third one that came, go to him. Don't go in like that as you received.
Son of a bitch!
Here. Son, let's go. The guys are already inside.
There are already 3 people inside.
Inside the house, the most terrible fights were starting. The mercenaries finding men with the last strength to face opponents who had stepped over the bodies of allies and knew that retreat was not an option. The fights within the confined spaces were quick and deadly. Shots spread out, lodging in the concrete or in bodies. The gunpowder only stopped bursting when the last enemy stopped breathing. The position was taken and consolidated with more artillery fire. It was not a time for rest, but for readiness until the rest of the soldiers reached them. No one was allowed to sit down, quite the contrary. The Russians kept pushing to the point of making the Ukrainians retreat as much as possible from the urban area of Bakhmut. They kept shooting more and more. The defenders started a suppression fire to allow their colleagues to retreat and protect themselves while less of the city remained in their hands. The Russian progression did not mean that the Ukrainians kept quiet. They couldn't stay on the defense forever. There was a strong resistance ready to put as many fallen Russian lives as possible inside and around Bakhmut. Almost 98% of the city was already in the hands of the enemies, and now it was necessary to defend the road to keep the oxygenation of a body already battered and trying to resist for months. The buildings had been gradually abandoned, leaving the Russians happy to capture the places without stepping on the bodies of their compatriots. However, the Ukrainians had other plans. No sooner were the buildings taken, the implosions happened, knocking down already fragile structures and burying soldiers while they smiled, relieved by the easy capture of a high position that would be great for a sniper. 230 Kievan joint direct attack munition bombs were dropped by MiG-29 on one of the city's tall buildings. The Ukrainians did not give up, clinging to every inch of ground and laying down their lives on them if necessary. The threats from the Wagner group caused a rush on the part of the regular Russian troops. In early May, parts of the city, still under Ukrainian command, were painfully bombarded, burning what remained of the corpse of a city once called Bakhmut. The flames spread through the streets in that diabolical spectacle that chilled souls. The Ukrainians did not believe for a moment in the words that the Wagner group had no ammunition. Seeing the artillery fall increasingly intense on them, they prepared a counter-strike that began to form in mid-May of 2023. It was becoming increasingly difficult for the Ukrainians to defend the urban area of the city. Most of the troops were forced to expel the Russians in the regions near the roads that still maintained the supply of soldiers in the urban area. It was in one of these battles that 3 groups joined together in a joint assault to eliminate the mercenaries of the Wagner group gathered on a hill. The 3rd Assault Company of the 1st Assault Battalion, under the command of the 3rd Assault Brigade, would join the 92 Mechanized Brigade for a joint attack against a higher position. The support from the ground unit with the drones would be essential to get through an area with virtually no cover. Foreign waters were dangerously shallow in some places, requiring the soldiers to be quick to search for April. Inside the BMP, the men tried to joke with each other to avoid the nervousness of a difficult battle. They knew that some of the places they occupied would return empty. No matter how successful the mission was, the tasks were getting harder and harder. Out of about 24 assault operations in the area, only 1 ended without casualties. The darkest day involved an operation northeast of Bakhmut, which left over 150 soldiers dead, injured, or missing. But there was no time to mourn. Tears dried in the heat of battle or trickled down to the butt of the gun resting on the shoulder. The Ukrainians left the BMP with their legs already sinking in the mud. Boots slipped as they tried to gain traction on the ground softened by rain and melting snow. The transport dropped them off near a ditch, which gave them time to start a run towards the enemy. Further ahead there was a line of destroyed trees, but they knew it would be of no use to them. The enemy was in trenches in completely open territory. The drones began to fly over the battle corner, throwing grenades prepared by the Earth unit. The Mavic 3 equipment followed the movement of the mercenaries in the trenches. The VOG-17 grenades were widely used, but the unit had replaced some of them with fragmentation explosives with a new aerodynamics. The entire operation needed that air support to indicate the positions of the Russians. Grenades were flying in the middle of the battlefield. The men felt the impact of the explosions on the trenches, ducking as the heat waves passed over them. A Russian realized that he couldn't hold the position. A man fired over the trenches and became an easy target in the desperate run. Another didn't notice when a kamikaze drone flew over his head, buzzing until it plummeted against the trench and threw shrapnel that injured the Russian enough to make him an easy prey. For the Ukrainians, he barely managed to defend himself when the AK-47 and 1004 appeared through the trench to charge the price for the land he had occupied. The soldiers' legs complained as the boots sank into the mud. The climb demanded more and more energy from them. The men were panting,
Trying.
to control their breathing in that difficult terrain. The heart was beating in a new rhythm when they were forced to climb on a terrain
Completely open.
to look for a hiding place. The world seemed to stop for a few seconds when they could be in the enemy's sights without any protection. The air support made sure the Russians stayed busy. The leader of the mercenary squad walked through the trench looking for the men still alive. He walked past mutilated bodies. One of the soldiers was still alive, nervously breathing inside a hole. He barely managed to talk to the leader, who kept walking. He reached the end of the deep trench area and returned resigned. He tried to warn the command with the radio, but the Ukrainians were too close. He ran to seek protection from the men coming ahead and forgot about what was above. Perhaps it was too many months inside buildings, but the mercenary didn't notice when the grenade fell. Wounded, he had to hide again inside the shelter he had carefully dug the day before. That was an experienced man. Fear would not be the thief of reason at that important moment. When the Ukrainians threw the first grenade at him, he picked it up and threw it out of the shelter. The smoke made him cough, and the dirt hit against his closed eyelids. He sheltered himself, hearing the quiet shots from the chests. He prepared his own grenades, throwing one at the Ukrainians at the same moment they returned the favor. One of the assault battalion soldiers moved slowly with the grenade in his hand. He knew he would be exposed in the trench. All it would take is for the mercenary to make a slight movement and he would have an easy target. The steps were careful and slow on the soft ground. He barely breathed, with his tense lungs holding the air and his hand sweating over the grenade. He threw the explosive, narrowly missing the target. He only started breathing again as he walked back. The mercenary was not hit, but the noise stunned him. He moved in the shelter, with his mind rattling. His ears protested at the pitch of war. He tried to throw a grenade, but it fell halfway to the opponents. He received suppressive fire that sank into the ground further ahead. The smoke from the explosive had dispersed, and he was trying to find another one in his vest. His only hope is to eliminate the two Ukrainians at once. The opponents must have realized that he wouldn't shoot. One of them advanced calmly, the AK-47 pointed, locked on the shoulder, the selector in automatic mode. The rifle's front and rear sights lined up on the Russian's hiding place. The mercenary's leg and one of his shoulders came into the line of sight. The Ukrainian leaned in and sank his finger into the trigger. The shots continued to sweep the shelter and the Russian's body, ending his last strengths. The Ukrainians played it safe. They finished the problem with another grenade. One of the mercenaries tried to hide from the relentless sight of the drones, but no hiding place or prayer stopped gravity from taking the grenade straight to the hideout. Wounded alone, surrounded by Morbid, the Russian tried to move, but the Ukrainians were already close. The projectiles flew over him, howling threats of death in his ears. Trembling and wriggling to escape, he didn't see when the Ukrainian hands began to throw the RGD-5 grenades. Thus, the trench fell. The defenders tried to hold on in Bakhmut. They advanced on many of the Russian positions, retaking some. In one of the cases, they had lost a fundamental trench to the Wagner group. The cost of victory for the mercenaries was high, destroying a good part of the assault battalion that day. The mission to help protect the flanks then fell to the Poton mercenaries. The Ukrainians sniffed out the weakness. The attack on the trench began with artillery and was followed by a risky assault. The men entered the Russian positions without sparing ammunition. The few Wagner mercenaries couldn't defend themselves. Each hole was cleaned to the sound of grenades, which were thrown into the darkness, from which moans and last words were heard. They called on the radio, but none of the local patrols responded. The Ukrainians kept advancing, cleaning every hole in the trench. There was no shortage of grenades. They entered every space where there was still a living Russian who refused to surrender. The Potok squad had retreated, and the exit from the position was crucial for the loss of a difficult Russian conquest. That event would cause tension among the mercenaries. The commanders of the Wagner private military company aggressively threatened a reprisal against the personnel of the private military company Potok and blocked their withdrawal and rotation to a safe zone. The accusations resonated among the Russians. The Potoks argued lack of ammunition, while the so-called musicians claimed they were men unprepared for the levels of combat in Baku. Thus, at the beginning of May, tensions were rising. The Ukrainian offensive had not yet begun, and the war continued to feed heaven and hell with souls, hospitals with mutilated bodies, and families with tears.